Welcome everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you to the Stimson Center for hosting this very important event. The other thing I want to add is that for those of us who weren't able to attend in person, we are recording this, so everyone in the room, we want you to know that as well, that you will be a part of this recording. Before starting this, I just want to open with some remarks that I was thinking of when I was preparing for this. I read something that said that gender-based violence during conflict is something that is inevitable, that it's something that can't be avoided. And that was very depressing for me to read for a variety of reasons. So on my way here, many delays on a plane, I drafted some opening remarks that I'd like to read really quick. So we're here today to shed light on an issue of tremendous gravity, an issue that threatens the dignity, security, and fundamental human rights of countless individuals around the world. The issue is sexual and gender-based violence in conflict. Throughout history, we've seen how conflict zones have been spaces of exacerbated inequality, where the dignity of human beings has been routinely violated in the most appalling ways. One of these violations is the perpetration of sexual violence, a disturbingly persistent form of aggression that tends to spike during conflicts. It is a deeply alarming and sorrowful reality that sexual violence in conflict settings has for far too long been dismissed as inevitable collateral damage. When we resort to such terminology, we inadvertently normalize the occurrence of these atrocities. The phrase inevitable collateral damage strips away the urgent need for a solution and instead portrays the problem as insurmountable, desolate, and beyond our reach to resolve. It cultivates a sense of hopelessness that fosters inaction and apathy, allowing the cycle of violence to continue unchecked. But we are gathered here to challenge this notion, to stand against the belief that such atrocities are simply an unavoidable consequence of conflict and the fragile post-conflict societies that it exists in. We are here to assert that no act of violence is inevitable, that no survivor is alone, and that no perpetrator is beyond justice. So with us today are four remarkable panelists who have dedicated their lives to pushing back against this narrative. They have made it their mission to address, combat, and ultimately solve the problem of conflict-related sexual violence and sexual gender-based violence. Their work spans policy implementation, legal reform, education, empowerment, and psychosocial support, demonstrating that there is not only hope but also tangible progress in this fight against CRSV and SGV victims. So it is my honor and privilege to introduce these exceptional individuals. We have Colleen Krenwelge from the State Department, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. Christy Edwards, Head of Policy Programs and Legal at Geneva Call. Lisa Sharland, who's the Senior Fellow and Director of the Protecting Civilians and Human Security Program at the Stimson Center. And then also virtually, we have Annie Modi. She is the Executive Director and founder of Afia Mama, working on women's access to basic social services, economic empowerment, participation in governance, politics, peace processes, and eradication of discrimination towards gender-based violence survivors and other minority groups. So please welcome all these people to the stage. All right, so Colleen, I first want to start with you. Maybe you could tell us a little bit, how does the State Department work to prevent SGBV in armed conflict, and what does prevention look like in a setting where conflict is already occurring?
Sure. Well, I should start by thanking you and our co-sponsors for having us here, for sponsoring this event. It's great to be here. And I might start off by saying, since you mentioned this quote you'd seen, or this something you've read that was so very depressing, that the United States absolutely does not accept that conflict-related sexual violence, that sexual and gender-based violence is an inevitable outcome or byproduct of conflict. We actually work from the idea that we can prevent it and that we should be working to prevent it. And it is our aim to prevent this kind of violence. And even in conflict settings, we firmly believe that we can prevent this sort of violence, and that prevention is our primary goal. So we're working across the US government to better integrate efforts to prevent sexual and gender-based violence with our efforts to prevent conflict and atrocities. I mean, of course, we know that that atrocities and sexual and gender-based violence are much more likely in conflict settings. So as part of our prevention efforts, we're actually looking to prevent conflict. So we're trying to anticipate, prevent, and respond to conflict around the world. That's exactly what my bureau does within the State Department, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. So as we look globally, our goal is to identify opportunities where U.S. government engagement could help prevent conflict and in turn prevent this sort of violence that we see and protect civilians. And we actually believe that we can intervene diplomatically and through programs on the ground to prevent conflict and improve the situations of civilians in conflict settings when conflict does emerge. And often people say, what does the government do on the ground? What do you actually do out there? We can take a variety of actions to prevent conflict or to prevent violence. And those actions might include private conversations with senior government officials. Sometimes it's the stuff we say behind closed doors that matters. Sometimes we decide that we should be making public statements, and we'll do that maybe to warn of potential conflict or to warn of atrocity risks. And often we'll partner with others, with like-minded countries who have the same views, and we'll issue joint statements or coordinated statements to call attention to what's happening or could happen. And sometimes we provide support, programmatic and financial support to civil society organizations who are working on the ground to address gender-based violence or who are working to prevent conflict or foster peace. And sometimes we impose or threaten to impose sanctions or visa-related restrictions on folks we believe might perpetrate violence or stoke conflict. And actually, from what I've seen from my experience overseas, sometimes those actions or the threat of those actions does have tangible results. You can see behavioral shifts and behavioral changes because certainly in the terms of visa restrictions, a lot of people want to travel to the United States and they don't want to risk being told that they or their family members can't. And of course, in conflict settings, we also provide humanitarian assistance to civilians affected by conflict, and we do that around the world on a huge scale. So we do think we can, in many cases, fund targeted programs that make a difference on the ground. And just as an aside, we do try to monitor our programs and their results to make sure that we're spending taxpayers' money wisely and effectively. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that the U.S. government does not believe that it's an inevitable thing, and it's something that we can work towards addressing. And actually, that brings me to my next question, because I believe in the recent memo from President Biden, he specifically says that it's not something that has to be inevitable. So maybe you can tell us how that recent memo on CRSV plays a role in these prevention efforts.
Sure. Generally, when it comes to prevention, we have a really good policy framework in place. So we, starting with the U.S. strategy to prevent gender-based violence globally, we have atrocity prevention frameworks in place. We have conflict prevention frameworks in place. So our approach to conflict prevention and to addressing sexual and gender-based violence has a very good policy framework. And this presidential memorandum you mentioned is just part of that framework. It's part of a holistic, whole-of-government approach that includes advancing gender equity and equality globally, because the presidential memorandum says that one of the best ways to prevent gender-based violence is to promote gender equity and equality. We look to address survivors' needs. That's a big part of what we do when we, of course, can't prevent violence, or despite our best efforts. And we look to amplify survivors' voices in transitional justice mechanisms. That's critical for so many survivors, right? They want to see the perpetrators of violence held accountable. So that memo from the president was an effort to elevate the U.S. government's efforts to promote justice and accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. The memo notes that we should use economic sanctions and visa restrictions, as I was discussing earlier, to do even more than what we have been doing to hold perpetrators of violence accountable.
Yeah. You also mentioned that you do things to monitor this issue and gather data and information. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you use data to anticipate and respond to these issues.
Sure. We have within our bureau a dedicated analytical unit staffed by experts in the collection and analysis of data. And so we use a variety of analytical tools, collect data from all over the world to try to improve our understanding of the scope, the scale, the drivers, and the consequences of gender-based violence. And we use similar tools to identify potential signs of conflict. I mean, as I mentioned, our goal worldwide is to prevent conflict. We've identified that as a national security interest. So we use all available tools, and we work with our partners across the U.S. government to identify signs of conflict so that we can take action before it occurs, identify warning signs of impending violence. And then we use data collection throughout our decision-making processes to try to respond as effectively as possible to conflict and violence when it emerges. And the collection of data and the analysis of situations as they evolve does help us calibrate our response and our reactions, and can at times help us make pronouncements publicly that are helpful in calling out abuses where they occur, as we've done in Ukraine and Ethiopia and Sudan, to name just a few recent cases. And data collection also allows us to design and to try to improve programs on the ground that are designed to get at some of the drivers of conflict and instability globally, and at some of the factors that lead to the emergence of conflict or to the emergence of or continuation of gender-based violence.
Maybe you can expand a little bit more on the drivers. I think a lot of people here would be interested. What do you see as being the drivers of these issues from the data?
Yeah, it can be widespread gender inequality or just inequity generally, financial and otherwise. Climate change is a huge driver these days of conflict and instability, and we across the government are increasingly aware of that and are trying to address it. It can be long-standing, ethnic or religious grievances or tensions that drive conflict. So there's a whole host of things that we look at when we're trying to identify what might cause a conflict to erupt.
All right. And then I know you mentioned earlier, and I think this is really, really important, and I think it's something that's not often, especially when for myself, where I do a lot more research and analytical thinking, sometimes you read these stories and you forget that these are actual individuals, and something that you mentioned was amplifying the voices of the victims, and something I wanted to touch on in that transitional justice post-conflict scenario. How can the needs and experiences of survivors be incorporated into post-conflict recovery and reconciliation? Maybe you can expand on that, because I think too often we forget about how important successful post-conflict transition is in avoiding conflict from reoccurring, and too often the atrocities that follow that.
Absolutely. I mean, so often we see that a conflict subsides only to erupt again, despite our best efforts, right? So our bureau and the U.S. government generally does try to look at all phases. We want to anticipate conflict if we can. We want to prevent it if we can. Then we have to respond to it, and after the fact, we have to help populations recover and rebuild. So I would say first that when we work with survivors, we try to do so in a trauma-informed manner. We try to keep in mind their experiences. We know we need to listen to them and to local leaders, especially women, because we all know women are disproportionately affected by violence, although they're not alone in it. So we know we need to listen to survivors and work with them, because of course they know best how to address their needs, and they know best the support and services they will need and their communities will need to recover and to move past violence and conflict. So we very much pursue a survivor-centered approach, as we call it, that puts their rights first and ensures they're treated with dignity and respect. And we tried to listen to them, as I was saying, to identify their needs and how best to respond to them. So in general, we take an approach that, as I said, puts them first and then allows us to partner with them, especially when we're designing programming initiatives and trying to provide services to meet the needs that they've identified. And those services could be access to health and education, and also access to justice and transitional justice mechanisms and accountability mechanisms.
So as part of the way that the U.S. government does this is by supporting on the ground, maybe like nationally led, grassroots organizations to do this, or are they placing people there to do this?
Absolutely. No, to the extent that we can, we always try to work with local partners and with people on the ground, because they know the context far better than we will. We don't want to parachute in and try to take over and impose what we think might be right. I mean, maybe that's a hard lesson that we've learned over the years, but we do try to work always, as much as possible, with local organizations. Yeah, so it's everything from civil society to government officials.
Okay. All right, well, now I want to transition over to Christy. So, and Christy works for Geneva Call. And Christy, first, maybe you want to tell people about Geneva Call so they can understand that.
Sure, thanks. And thank you, of course, to Stimson and to the American Red Cross for partnering with us on this event today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Geneva Call, we are a humanitarian organization headquartered in Geneva, of course. But we work in quite a few places in conflict contexts around the world, working specifically with armed groups and de facto authorities, or AGDAs, because it's a little bit of a mouthful, to engage with them on humanitarian norms and principles in order to protect civilians in armed conflicts. And so we do that through a fairly long-term and sustained engagement process where we have local staff working on the ground who know the context, know the communities, and are able to work with these groups as they, many of the armed groups especially are coming from these local communities, and so it's important that we have local folks on the ground who are able to have these conversations and to be able to not only learn about the humanitarian norms and principles to which they are obliged to uphold, but then to start to really put those into practice. So maybe as the conversation goes on, we'll talk a little bit more about how we do that.
Well, I mean, staying on that topic a little bit, do you find that sometimes when it comes to these, it's not so much that they're openly, these groups are openly disregarding those obligations, it's simply that they don't know a lot of the times?
In many cases, yes. There is a lack of awareness or knowledge of some of the rules that come under international humanitarian law. If you think, I think there's a lot of law students in the room today. If you think about the number of people maybe in this city who know human rights law in the whole city, it's not a huge number of folks. Then maybe the folks that know international humanitarian law, we're getting to maybe a smaller group of folks. Then international criminal law, and then how does that apply in a military or a conflict setting? Even in Washington, D.C., you've got a limited number of folks that know the rules, really. And so then when you think about, are there people who have gone to law school, who know and have studied the rules of warfare and understand their legal obligations in armed conflicts? That's not probably a huge number of folks, and so the lack of knowledge or awareness is quite striking in many contexts. And so we do work with armed groups on the ground to raise their awareness, to increase their knowledge, and then to work with them around specific patterns of behavior or revisions of their internal codes of conduct, signing unilateral declarations or specific tools that we call deeds of commitment, in order for them to start actually putting this into practice so that they are able to apply the normative frameworks that are not only from within their own communities, but also the international frameworks to which they are technically obliged to uphold.
Yeah. So given that you're probably working with, it's a case-by-case basis based on the group. Like some of them might have a greater capacity than others. But specific, so some you might have to start at ground zero when you're talking about this stuff. Some you might have already been engaging with, so they might be familiar with certain obligations. But specifically about sexual violence and armed conflict and protection of civilians, maybe you can expand, like how do you get in the door to have these conversations with these de facto authorities and armed groups? And so maybe tell us about that process, because I think it's incredibly important. The more non-state armed groups are becoming probably a main player in conflicts we see today.
Yeah.
And so it's incredibly important to engage with them at this level to better provide protection. So maybe you can specifically about today's topic expand on that.
And maybe just as an interesting fact for this audience to know, with most armed conflicts around the world, most of them are non-international armed conflicts, so non-state armed groups fighting against a state authority. And the ICRC estimates that there are between 500 and 600 armed groups around the world who are engaging in armed conflicts. So that is a lot of armed groups, and they control a huge amount of territory, and the territories that they control have hundreds of millions of civilians living under their control. And of course, as we've already been talking about, while not it shouldn't be assumed that it is inevitable. Sexual violence does occur in many conflicts, or the risk of violence is quite high in many of these conflicts. So in situations where Geneva Call works, where there's a very low level of capacity, let's say, or a low level of knowledge, we will literally start with awareness raising tools. For example, years ago, we worked with a bunch of Kurdish women's organizations and groups that members of the PKK to create a booklet around sexual and gender-based violence, so that it described just generally what the legal provisions are, so that they were aware and knowledgeable about the rules governing sexual violence and armed conflict. Once we've started to raise that awareness, whether it be through booklets or posters, sometimes we've in one group actually, in one area in DRC, there was a song that actually became really popular in the local discotheques. We start to do trainings frequently with armed groups, where we will go through and talk about the specific legal provisions that are under IHL or under the normative frameworks to which they might be subject in the areas where they're operating. A few years ago in Syria, we started a training session on sexual violence and just gender discrimination with a group called the Educated Women's Association in Syria, and they partnered with a group called the Afak Academy, and held over 30 training sessions, including awareness-raising sessions, not only with armed groups, but with other local civil society organizations and community-based organizations, to raise awareness of these provisions, not only with the groups, the armed groups themselves, but other communities and stakeholders in those areas. We've also then started working with them, as the knowledge, of course, increases. We then start working with armed groups to work with them on their internal policies and their procedures to address sexual and gender-based violence. And we've recently been working with some groups in Myanmar to revise their internal code of conduct to make sure that sexual violence is specifically prohibited by their fighters when they are engaging in hostilities. It also included provisions around the minimum age of recruitment, so that young people, predominantly boys, but there are a number of girls who also join the armed forces, or the armed groups there. And of course then to prohibit sexual violence. We have another tool which we call a unilateral declaration. So it's something that's usually crafted by the group themselves to say we specifically acknowledge our responsibilities under international humanitarian law or under human rights law to take certain actions. So we've got a number of groups who have signed unilateral declarations which incorporate prohibitions on sexual violence. We actually had 3, I think, signed in DRC last week with different armed groups, specifically saying that they have outlawed the use of sexual violence in their internal mechanisms, and that there will be, of course, internal consequences if anyone is found to have done so. But it's a unilateral document or statement done by the group, and it's usually just done at the local level. And then our strongest tool, which some of you might be familiar with, is what we call the deed of commitment. And this is a standardized tool, so the language is the same for all armed groups that sign this. And I think of it as a tiny little mini Geneva Convention, where they come to Geneva, they sign the deed of commitment in front of the Canton of Geneva, and it's deposited with the canton as the repository. Geneva countersigns as a witness, saying, this is the highest level of accountability and promise that this kind of behavior will not occur. And so we have about 25 armed groups that have signed this deed of commitment specifically on sexual violence and gender discrimination. So there's a lot of different varieties of tools that we use, and engagement that we have, and certainly levels of accountability that come with those processes.
Okay. Yeah, and to that point, so I think it's one thing to, because you kind of mentioned that these obligations they already have these obligations. Mm-hmm. This is kind of them recognizing that in a very formal manner. So I guess my question for you is, do you guys follow, and keep any data on, that it's not losing steam or something along those lines. What has the data shown you as like maybe years down the road after they've signed?
It's certainly an issue that continues to be of concern, let's say. And it's, we don't expect groups to go from, zero to perfection overnight. It is a constant process of conversation and continued training, continued discussion. We don't see the, signing a deed of commitment as the end point.
Yeah.
We see it as another step in the process to go along that journey of ensuring greater protection of civilians. And I would also say it's not just, I think one of the nice things about the way in which we work is that it's not just, here's a Geneva Convention, if you're not following chapter and verse, you're going to be hauled off to The Hague and sanctioned under the Rome Convention. We're not engaging in that kind of a conversation, and I think that also is important because so many of these groups, as non-state actors, are have a very legitimate statement of, well, we didn't negotiate in those treaty conversations, we didn't sign any treaty obligations. Why is it that we should have to follow these obligations? So because we're not going in and saying, well, the ICRC, Geneva Convention, et cetera, ICRC's discussions on these topics, and the ICCPR says this and this and this, and CEDAW says that. But we go in and have these conversations, again, because we have local staff on the ground who are able to engage in these conversations to talk about what are the local norms and values, whether they are based on local traditions, local customs, local religious values, tribal customs, because there's always something that we can find common ground upon. And whether it's protection for women or protection for vulnerable community members. And so we do find that common ground to say, how can we find the things that you already are implementing or believe in, and then show the linkages within the humanitarian system to say, here's how you can better strengthen these protections, or how can you integrate this into your own practices, so that it's not it's not a foreign Western imperialist concept that we're bringing in, but something that is truly from the ground up, that is already familiar to them. And then we're able to, if violations do occur, of course, then we can talk about, well, what's the local custom for dealing with these violations, whether it's a transitional justice norm or some other sort of local justice mechanism that they can, for the armed group themselves, that they can put into practice to address any of the issues or violations that do come up.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes to what Colleen was saying, like, the most successful measures are not stuff that is just imposed, like you have to do this. And obviously there's a different power dynamic between the State Department or the U.S. government saying something and a nonprofit organization at the same time, but it's about getting them to take ownership of it, because when people take ownership, they're more likely to, want to keep the commitment that they're doing. So when you help them revise these military manuals or trainings, you're not saying, oh, you got to rephrase that, but you're helping lead them to want to rephrase it to meet that obligation, take ownership of the law, like respecting the law.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, it sounds like you're working with a lot of actors, because it's not just that you have the non-state armed group. Like, those are usually based in communities, and there's lots of other organizations working with them. So there's multiple stakeholders in this area that you're working with, and there's already, like Colleen mentioned, a lot of people, stakeholders when it comes to addressing sexual-based violence and armed conflict. So maybe you can talk about how the importance of working cohesively to ensure better protection for these individuals in these situations, specifically about SGBV.
Yeah. So while Geneva Call's primary focus is on working with armed groups, we also take a comprehensive and holistic approach when addressing these issues, because armed groups don't operate in a vacuum. They don't live in a vacuum. Many of the armed groups that we are working with, they live and are from the communities in which they control territory. So, when you go and talk to an armed group about, protection of children or access to education, well, their families live right down the street. Their children go to schools, right down the road as well. So they have a local interest in making sure that their communities, their families are protected. But because we're not just talking to the armed groups, we are also talking to local community leaders, local religious authorities, local women's associations, government and political leaders, who all have an interest and also might be able to exert some community pressure on some of these armed groups to abide by their obligations, because of course they have an interest in making sure that the communities are protected in these situations. So we try to not only, of course, primarily focus on working with the AGDAs themselves, but also we think of it as like a translation exercise. So not only would we do a training for the armed group, let's say on child protection, not targeting, not recruiting underage children to join the armed forces. But then we can also have a conversation with local community groups or local educators to say, hey, just making sure you also know your rights in this area, you know what your protections should be. And so then when they are interacting, that they can use the same language, they have a common denominator to talk about what their rights are, what concerns they have, and how to make sure that those issues are translated into a way that will make sense and that resonate, and that the same language is used by multiple voices in a community, and not just Geneva Call, even with our wonderful staff on the ground, but also with a wide variety of voices all saying the same thing.
Yeah, I mean it's not just about one person or one group or one entity understanding what the obligations are and protections are. Sometimes other people don't even know they have these rights, or they are entitled to these protections at the same time, and so you have to make sure that they're aware, so they can also, as a community, hold each other accountable.
Absolutely.
At the same point. So how do sexual and gender-based issues relate to other humanitarian issues? You've kind of touched on this a little bit, but specifically Geneva Call, how does it relate to other issues that you're working on?
Sure. So as I think you've probably gotten from what I've said so far today, all of these issues are interconnected. Yep. And sexual violence, of course, is also interconnected with many other issues that we work on. So, of course, we have a deed of commitment, and gender and sexual violence is one of our thematic priorities. But these issues are also integrated specifically into the other thematic topics that we work on. So, for example, recently in Burkina Faso, we've been working with armed groups around child protection and sexual violence. So we've incorporated specific language in an additional deed of commitment on child protection that specifically prohibits sexual violence, in addition to ensuring that children have access to school and that they are not recruited into the armed forces, where often they are potentially vulnerable to acts of sexual violence if they are recruited at a young age. In the DRC, we've been working with groups specifically around healthcare issues and access to healthcare. And so some of the work that we've done with AGDAs on the ground has resulted in access to healthcare facilities for pregnant women in particular, so that they don't have to pay taxes or fees to an armed group in order to be able to access the healthcare facilities. I was in Juba about 2 weeks ago, and looking at some issues there around famine and food insecurity, access to education and sexual violence. And because Geneva Call has been working very closely with some of the armed groups in the area who have been attacking marketplaces or setting fire to crops or cattle raiding. And when access to food sources dramatically drop, that often means that women will have to search in far greater distances for access to wild food sources. If they are traveling for days at a time to access wild food sources, they are frequently subject to violence in many different ways when accessing those food sources. Then they come home, and then they have to prepare those food sources, which takes much more time. And frequently, when it comes to food preparation, it's the girl children who are involved in that process, and so they are withheld from going to school because it takes more time for them to prepare food for their families. So there's all of these different reverberating effects, to use an IHL colloquialism. There's all these interconnected and social and legal issues that come up. Whether it's because it's driven by community violence or climate change or a number of other issues. So we're looking at how do these issues play out across a wide spectrum of issues, and then to make those linkages whenever possible so that we can, again, address these issues holistically and not just say, well, don't do that, don't do that, and don't do that, but helping them, make those linkages between why these issues are problematic and how they, as armed groups, but also community leaders and other actors in the communities, can work together to resolve some of these issues.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point that you brought up, because I think often we just focus on a specific incident. We don't necessarily always focus on what allowed that incident to occur. So this interconnectedness, like you were saying, even just distance of travel, that increases the likelihood of certain things happening. Does the data show that from the research of the State Department?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's something that I think, there's a lot of different stakeholders in this room, and I think we always sometimes focus on what our niche area is, and we forget about, like, climate change, for example. Like, it's not just, the direct results of climate change, but it's impacting lots of other things, from migration to conflict over resources, mass urbanization. Like, everything is interconnected, and we need to keep that mindset. And that's why we have conversations like this, because that allows us to learn from each other and feed off of each other and go out and be more knowledgeable and whatnot about that situation. Well, thank you, Christy. And now I want to go to Lisa Charland from the Stimson Center Protecting Human Security Program. So, Lisa, why is conflict-related sexual violence something that peacekeeping missions are involved in addressing?
Thanks, Christian, and thanks to my fellow panelists and those joining us today and coming here for the conversation with these partners. It's a really interesting question, and I just wanted to take a step back before jumping into that, because I think a number of people in this room would have seen yesterday that there was news out from the UN that there's now an estimated 110 million people displaced globally. And that if you were to compare that to the number of displaced globally about 10 years ago, it was about half that figure. And the reason I mention that is, and we know part of the cause for this is, we have, war in Ukraine and conflict in Sudan and so many things across the globe that are forcing civilians and displacing them out of where they live internally and as refugees. And the reason I mention that is we know that armed conflict and displacement heightens the risk of sexual violence in these contexts, in these settings. And we know, coupled with that at the moment, that we are seeing, increasing militarisation and closure of civic space in places and all these sort of factors that are contributing to these things. So I wanted to mention that at the outset. And I think at this point, if I'm not mistaken, although someone can correct me if I'm wrong, next day on June 19th is the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence and Conflict. And it marks 15 years since the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1820, which is part of a series of resolutions that many would be familiar here on women, peace and security. And I mention that because that resolution was so pivotal in that it recognised that sexual violence, when used or commissioned as part of a tactic of war in order to target civilians, is linked to the maintenance of international peace and security. So I set that up in terms of the question, in terms of, why does UN peacekeeping have a role in this? At the end of the day, it is about sort of looking at how we maintain peace and security. So that's not to put aside the human rights dimension and, gender equality and things, but this is inherently linked, obviously, to some of these issues and goes back to what Colleen was saying there about, how do we prevent conflict and these other things that it's linked to. So specifically in relation to peacekeeping, at present, in terms of the missions that the UN has deployed, and part of the reason I'm talking this through is this is a lot of the research that we focus on here in our program at the Stimson Centre. Missions in the Central African Republic, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Mali, in South Sudan have an explicit mandate to prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence. And we're increasingly seeing that in contexts where there are what we call special political missions that are deployed by the UN as well. And why is this the case? Well, many in here would know history in terms of, at the moment, peacekeeping is commemorating its 75 years anniversary. But for many of those early decades, the types of missions that were deployed were sort of monitoring ceasefires. These weren't the types of things that they were focused on. And then we saw in the 1990s the tragedies that unfolded in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia in terms of civilians being attacked and not protected, and the peacekeeping mission standing by. And similarly, sexual and gender-based violence occurring on mass scale and mass proportions. And so you saw this concerted effort by the Security Council in 1999 to adopt its first resolution on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. It authorised the first peacekeeping mandate that had an explicit protection of civilians mandate. And in parallel with that, you also started to see recognition by the Security Council about how women are tied into this. And we've talked about, it's not just women and girls who are affected by this, but nonetheless they are disproportionately affected by sexual and gender-based violence in conflict settings. And so you started to see recognition that, again, peace and security were linked to things like women's protection, their role in conflict prevention, their participation at the table in terms of not only their own protection, but as part of these political processes. And so that started to permeate into the design of peacekeeping missions like the ones that we see today. So I guess that's a little bit of the context as to why that there is an expectation there that peacekeeping missions and peacekeepers will intervene to protect at both that physical protection end, and we'll come, I guess, to a few of the other factors. But the point, just before I wrap that up, that I want to make at the end of the day is really, at the end of the day, the peacekeeping mission here is intervening because the government or the state is not in a position to provide and afford that protection from sexual and gender-based violence.
Okay, so to that end, because it's a priority for those missions, what are they doing to prevent that?
No, look, and I think there's a couple of avenues that we've seen, and a lot of this is documented in the mandates that the Security Council has at the moment. So I'll highlight 4, I guess, where we see some of this. The first is that protection piece that I mentioned there. And there's a very explicit protection mandate in those 4 peacekeeping missions that I mentioned and a number of others to protect civilians that are under threat of physical violence. And they also go into detail in relation to sexual and gender-based violence. So there's this expectation that peacekeeping missions will intervene, and they use a number of different mechanisms. We're talking about a military, police and civilian endeavour here. And over the last 20 years in particular, we've seen a range of innovations in terms of what peacekeeping missions have done to intervene and protect civilians, to protect women who may be at threat or risk of sexual and gender-based violence. So, for instance, we see the deployment of women protection advisors who deploy and work as part of missions to look at the monitoring, analysis and reporting arrangements that have been established as part of the work on conflict-related sexual violence across the UN system, to understand some of the early warning mechanisms, to work with the force component in the mission and so on. We have gender advisors that are deployed, again, have an important and critical role here in understanding some of the particular threats to the population. We have community liaison assistants in some missions, joint protection teams, so that is, sort of saying to the military component, working with the civilian component. Again, this is not traditionally a task that militaries have been equipped with, but there is an expectation here, and there has been a whole suite of scenario-based training developed to equip military personnel deploying to intervene in situations which isn't really part of traditional military training. There's a lot of early warning mechanisms and tools. So that physical protection piece, I think, is often so visible because when there isn't a response and there isn't a reaction by the peacekeeping mission, you see the drastic and unfortunate consequences. And we still see that playing out in missions today in terms of the levels of sexual and gender-based violence that are taking place. The second one I'd refer to is some of the justice and accountability measures that are put into peacekeeping mandates in an effort to end impunity around some of these issues. The reason that sexual and gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence is often ongoing is because for some of the groups or actors that may be involved, there's a sense of impunity that they're not going to be caught, they're not going to be held accountable. So we've seen missions work with other actors within the UN system. For instance, there's a team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict that has worked in mission settings, including the UN mission in the Central African Republic, for instance, and working with efforts there around the judicial system to establish those mechanisms to be able to respond and ensure there are judicial mechanisms for those that are survivors and victims of sexual and gender-based violence. Another key component to that, of course, is making sure that the domestic justice system and the police capacity are in a position to do investigations, to look after evidence and so on. So that capacity building piece and working on that justice and accountability piece. The third I'd briefly refer to is enabling a survivor-centred approach, ensuring there's support, responses, services, referral and support. These are things I won't go into too much detail because I do know our next panellist knows much more about this than me and can talk directly to a number of these issues. But I think that is such a key area and one that I think recently has really come to the forefront of conversations around some of these issues and what peacekeeping missions need to do to enable that and go to some of the points that have been raised about the fact that those intervening from the outside don't necessarily know what the best mechanisms or responses are. And I think it's, working with partners and locals around that. And the fourth piece I'd refer to there is the prevention and the longer term efforts to shift attitudes. And I think for me, this is an area where it is a significant challenge in terms of conversations around whether it be gender equality or gender norms and all these things that permeate it. I was looking back, for instance, at the recent findings of the Human Rights Council Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan. And it was looking, for instance, at some of the different factors that contribute to sexual and gender-based violence in these settings. Some of it's structural, so you sort of see there's this link between levels of domestic violence, but sort of this continuum of violence that you see taking place. Some of it relates to entrenched patriarchy and control of resources, this idea that women might be viewed as territory. You also see sexual violence that's instrumentalised in a way in terms of a reward system or building some kind of solidarity. And so when you have some of those attitudes permeating some of these conflict settings, how do you start to tackle those conversations? And I know Christy there has gone to some of the important conversations that they're having with a number of the groups that are involved to sort of tackle that. And I think that, again, is an ongoing challenge. And when you look to peacekeeping missions, some of the things they are looking at is those broader conversations around gender equality and women's role in society. How do you work with civil society actors around some of these issues to sort of unpack and, I guess, dispel some of these myths around what the expectations are for men and women in society? So they're, I guess, a few of the mechanisms that peacekeeping missions are engaged with at the moment.
So, you've mentioned some of the challenges already, but what do we need to know and what do we need to do to address those challenges? Or what other challenges can you expand on? Because I think to truly attempt to solve the problem, you have to be able to continuously find out what's working and what's not working, and what is, what's causing issues for you. What are the challenges what are challenges are you seeing? So what challenges need to be addressed? Maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple. I think the first at the outset, and as I referred to at the beginning, is at the end of the day, the responsibility to protect the civilian population, to protect those from sexual and gender-based violence rests with the host authorities. And in a number of settings, part of the challenge is that security forces that may be working as part of the host authorities or the national security forces may be actually the ones committing some of these abuses. And that sets up a tension for peacekeeping missions in terms of the way they are there with the consent of the host authorities, and this is a broader issue that we see playing out at the moment. And therefore, how do you manage that relationship in terms of how you engage and carry out your mandate, but also engage with your counterparts in the National Security Services or the Defence Force and say, these are commitments that you need to adhere to going forward. And this is part of human rights due diligence policy and a whole host of other things that peacekeeping missions are engaged in. I think a key challenge here also is this idea around resources, and this is a point that is brought up frequently. So even though you might see the Security Council authorise the mission, authorise it to do something, it may not then in its budgetary committees authorise the resources that you actually need to carry that out. Or you may not have member states who are in a position to provide the expertise that you need in these settings. And that's a particular tension we've seen with women protection advisors, for instance, that we haven't seen enough of them deployed to peacekeeping missions. The UN has expressed, and by UN I say a number of different entities have expressed a preference that we see more women protection advisors beyond peacekeeping missions in country settings, working across regions. But again, you see that being cut back in these budgetary conversations. And again, there is a lot of geopolitics and tensions around some of these issues as well that play into those discussions. So that's a really core challenge that continues to be brought up that needs to be addressed. I think another piece or another challenge I'd mention here is peacekeeping missions are not there forever. And at some point they need to transition. And we're seeing these conversations take place at the moment. I know we're going to hear from Annie in a moment, and certainly the mission that's deployed in the Democratic Republic of the Congo at the moment is undergoing these conversations around transition at the moment. And during a UN Security Council meeting, there is an informal expert group that meets on women, peace and security in the Security Council. And there was a meeting that took place in December last year on the topic of women protection advisors. And the Women Protection Advisor, who was deployed as part of MONUSCO, which is the mission in the DRC, noted a couple of challenges that they were facing. One, for instance, was the fact that the drawdown of that mission and the closure of certain field offices was making it more challenging in terms of mounting a response to sexual and gender-based violence. That the ongoing anti-mission sentiment was inhibiting the ability of them to get the message out around conflict-related sexual violence, and even a reluctance to engage with human rights officers, which I think is a very concerning development. And furthermore, it also went on to talk about the resurgence of some of the armed groups, in particular M23 in that context, and the impact that was having in terms of national security vacuums where you're having forces deployed elsewhere, which were perhaps providing a protective environment. So I think what we're seeing in that context is that there are some challenges in transition processes around mission and making sure that the resources are there when the mission departs to make sure that we still are able and in a position to prevent and protect against sexual and gender-based violence. And I think finally that point that I made earlier around addressing some of the norms and attitudes is a really key challenge, and how to tackle that, I think, because it's not just something that's isolated to conflict settings. I know there was a UNDP report that came out yesterday around sort of a backslide in attitudes around gender equality, and I think this plays into this conversation around conflict-related sexual violence as well. Just one point I will make, because this often comes up in conversations that I haven't gone into depth about, is often one of the reasons or the rationales for increasing women's participation in peacekeeping missions is this idea that they are better placed to engage with communities, engage with affected survivors or victims of sexual violence. And I guess the one point I just want to make on that, because this is a challenge I think that we're also facing here, is indeed that is critical, but it's also a shared responsibility of women and men. And I think we've also got to be really cautious in this conversation to make sure that we're not instrumentalising women in terms of their role in having an additional responsibility to tackle this issue. And I don't think that's certainly been proposed by anyone. I think most people in this room would be very well aware of that. But I think that's a really important point to make, because often it kind of falls back to, well, for those women there, they're the ones who have to tackle this issue, when actually it's a shared responsibility across the board. And I know that's an ongoing conversation in peacekeeping at the moment.
That's important to just remember always when we're having this conversation. Also, that it's not just women are primarily majority of the victims, but they're not, men and boys are also the victims as well, and they're often overlooked too when we have these conversations, and that's important to remember. One thing I do still want to follow up on is, you said there's a reluctance at times to work with human rights organizations. Is that what you said? Where does the reluctance come from? Sorry.
So to clarify that point, that was in relation to the transition process that was happening in the mission at the moment. The fact that there was a degree of anti-mission sentiment, and that may be sort of, I guess, having a bit of a pushback around individuals being willing to go and engage with different officers within the mission because of sentiments around how the mission's being perceived. And again, that was echoing a comment that was made by someone who was talking to the Security Council.
Christy, I have a question for you really quick, because just on this idea of reluctance, I know you clarified it, but do you ever have any groups, like, they're just reluctant to talk to Geneva Call about certain issues? Like, they'll talk to you, they're willing to talk about certain means of warfare, but we're not talking about gender equality. Like, they just push back and they're like, I'm not interested in having that conversation with you. How do you address that?
I mean, certainly that comes up. It's more of maybe less of a, we don't want to talk about it, but we're fine.
It's not a fail to recognize.
Yeah, we don't have that problem. Our troops don't ever commit sexual violence, and so then it becomes a part of an ongoing conversation of frequent engagement. And I think that's where also some of the conversations that we're having with other community members, community groups, women's associations, that where we are hearing a fuller picture. Obviously, we're not taking everything that we hear at face value, and so when we do hear about circumstances or violations or challenges that are coming up, well, then we can raise it in a diplomatic way, of course, and then engage in that conversation. I think one of the things that the Geneva Call actually really excels in, actually, is for many humanitarian organizations who are doing service delivery, they often will have probably more challenges than we do in having direct conversations with the armed groups, because there's an ask there, right? They're trying to move goods from point A to point B, or have access to a certain area, whereas Geneva Call, we're not going in and asking for anything. And so we are able to truly just develop a relationship and a long-term engagement process. And so then when other humanitarian organizations have challenges with access, or, heaven forbid, somebody gets kidnapped or taken hostage or detained, or some other types of issues come up, it's frequently Geneva Call that is asked to go in and have a conversation with the armed groups about a different organization's humanitarian needs or the safety and security of their staff. So then we are able to engage in that kind of a circumstance where we can have that open conversation to talk about specific and sort of granular level issues of concern, let's say.
Well, now I want to turn to our panelist, Annie Modi, who's joining us remotely. And I have some questions for you, Annie, and I know we spoke briefly about them, but Lisa also kind of put you in place to kind of respond to some of the stuff she was talking about. So before getting to the questions that you and I have already discussed, I want to see if you would like to add on to anything Lisa said about the topic at hand and also peacekeeping missions.
Thank you very much for that interesting conversations that has just come up on my fellow panelists. Maybe to just add on the presentation, I think Christy was talking about the MONUSCO peacekeeping challenges in the Democratic Republic of Congo. One challenge that I would like to point out also was the gap in communication between what the peacekeeping mission was standing out as a message and the one our states was sending out as a communication. And secondly, I think also that the MONUSCO as a peacekeeping mission did not at the beginning collaborate enough or work enough with local organizations. I would talk for women, as I run one women organization on the ground, to communicate in the community. And this left a window to politicians ahead of elections to use the conflict, to use the fact that MONUSCO has been around and still the war is not ending, to manipulate many youth groups, which led to the attack on the peacekeeping mission on the 25th of July 2022. So I wanted to point this gap out so that maybe when we are talking, we are moving on recommendations. We've done that already. I personally visited the UN Security Council to recommend that the peacekeeping mission should amplify its communication with local women organizations as well as youth organizations, not just in terms of sending out many messages, but also in the format that was accessible to local community. Because when you are in this many regions where there are conflict, people don't speak French, and many of the messages goes out in French. When you're in these places, people don't understand English. And messages that went out was mostly in French, and it's left local leaders. I will insist on ahead of elections because we noticed a pattern in the Democratic Republic of Congo. When there is no election, the state or the government is in a good relationship with the peacekeeping mission leaders and to collaborate in protection of civilians. A pattern we have watched is in 2011 elections. Just before that, there were tension between government and the peacekeeping mission. And in 2018, the same thing happened. And as civil society, we tried to raise up, to send out early warning to avoid the same thing to happen. Unfortunately, there were not enough communication accessible. I will insist on accessibility of information. I think the Geneva Code will understand what I mean, because in the local context, but we don't know how, when, through which groups to set out that information can then be misunderstood. I wanted to follow up on that.
Annie? Sorry. You were making a really, really good point, and I was hoping that you could just back up, if you could just do a quick mic check, because I heard part of what you said at the very end, but I'd like you to maybe re-say it once more for our audience, because everything that you're saying about the importance of communication, I think is so important to hear. Could you go back a little bit and repeat what you just said.
Okay, thank you very much. I was saying that the challenge is to be effective is not just the message, but it's also
So we seem to be having some trouble with your mic, Annie. But I want you, maybe you can just tell me if I'm understanding this correctly, that the problem with communication is that in many cases, it's not done in the way that's going to be effective for the community where the message is being sent.
exactly.
Okay. Yeah, and that time works perfectly. So hopefully that keeps up with us. Yeah. But I honestly, I wasn't expecting that part about communication, because I think that's such a key component about making sure that there is protections for people during conflict, is communicating correctly to the audience that you're speaking to. And sometimes we only speak to the audience that we're familiar with, and we don't even recognize that what we're trying to do is not effective, because we're not even thinking about how the audience that needs to hear it is going to receive it, what we're saying. So I think communication is something that every organization can do a better job at. And I think that requires all of us working cohesively together at the same time. So I really, really appreciate those comments. For me, I think that's very, very insightful. And I know you mentioned that incorporating some of these at local organizations, which you are the co-founder of one of them, and that's Afia Mama. Maybe first, can you tell us what Afia Mama does to support in general, and then also how does it support victims of sexual gender-based violence? Let's do a mic check, one more. No, I can barely hear you.
Hello?
Yes,
Is that you now?
that is perfect.
Okay. I was saying, Afia Mama first is the word inside that we can.
Stop you really quick, Annie, I hate to do that, but we can't hear everything that you're saying. Some words coming in, but maybe one of our panelists is familiar with Afia Mama, or I can speak on what I know about it, and Annie, hopefully you're going to be able to add on to what I'm saying. But I mentioned it when I mentioned your name, and I found it to be quite impressive, the amount of work that you're doing. So it works to provide access to basic social services for women, economic empowerment, participation in governance, politics, peace process, and eradication of discrimination towards gender-based violence survivors and other minority groups. So you're doing a lot of things there, and I think that's so important. And at the same time, I'd like to just emphasize that from what I'm reading, it's not just about addressing the problem or recognizing the problem. You also have to support the people who are experiencing the problem directly, because you can't just acknowledge it and then go after the perpetrator of something and leave the person forgotten. You also have to help them rebuild from what happened to them directly. But is there anything else you'd like to add on about exactly how you go about supporting the victims? We're going to try one more time.
Hello? Is
Yes,
it clear?
perfect. Yes.
Thank you. We also do a lot of early warning and so we do clubs and we do peace education so that young people can avoid getting this is in the country as broken out that contact today. And in the early warning, as I said, we share information either with the peace mission. Are you still getting me? Hello?
I'm not sure at times. Can you, we'll try one more time. Can you expand on the early warning stuff? And if not, I'm going to ask our panelists to also talk about that. I know the data part is part of that recognition, And then also maybe you guys can expand about maybe things that we can all do collectively to look at problems before they occur. But can you expand on how you do the early warning part?
The early warning part, the way we do it, community, we do conflict and community analysis, and when we see the tensions that might be coming between the community,
So is there a place that we can see information about the early warning part? Because unfortunately, we're not able to, it's not coming through clear on our end, and that's unfortunate. But if maybe you can nod your head, is it on your website and I can refer people there, because it's incredibly important, but unfortunately we just can't understand exactly. So is it on your website, organization website? Okay, I think she's typing something. Somebody can resend that message to me. All right, so anyways, one thing that she talked about was and you spoke about it kind of, is using the tools that we have and taking an analytical approach to finding problems before the problems appear. Does anybody want to also touch on that? So I know the data approach is one thing. Can you just expand, like, how are you getting the data? Is it from organizations doing this type of work, or is it just people on the ground and from?
It's a little of both. Often we use commercially or publicly available data sets, like the Armed Conflict Location and Event Database. We use a lot of their data in our analytical products. Sometimes we buy access to data sets. Sometimes we offer money for the creation of new data sets. As we work in some countries around the world, we see, of course, that there isn't a whole lot of data available, so we will work with local organizations to try to improve data collection to feed into some of our programmatic efforts.
So, Christy, from Geneva Calls perspective, when you're going in, is that pretty much open source data that you're getting to, or?
Yes, and I think it also, a lot of our data, it might not be quantitative data that we're working with, but it comes from our conversations with folks on the ground. So because we have local staff based in the field, and we have a lot of not only offices at the capital level, but also in field offices as well throughout many of the countries in which we work, a lot of the information is coming to us from those field offices because they are embedded within these communities and understand the issues and challenges as they happen truly on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. And what about peacekeeping missions? Like, they have to have some data before they can, recognize the problems occurring. So where are they getting this information? Pretty much the same across the board that was already mentioned?
I think so, and a part of it is also you have a number of people in different roles, whether it's civil affairs officers through to those engaging directly with communities to understand a little bit about the different drivers of conflict, the impact, early warning mechanisms. So I think it's a mixture of the open source data that you've got there, but also the work that the mission itself is doing in working with different organisations to understand a little bit more about what is happening in the conflict patterns and use that to inform the response that the mission has.
And one thing important about having a good data is you have the complete information. And I know you mentioned something about the amount of people displaced in the world, and President Biden also mentioned certain quantitative numbers in his memo, but it was also mentioned that for every one, there's probably 10 or 20 more. And for every displaced person, there's a bunch of displaced people that you don't even know because they're either in the shadows or they're internally displaced, for example, and that's just somebody who moved within the confines of the country, so people aren't always getting the correct data. So having complete data is incredibly important. So what, from each of your, the organizations that you represent or your areas of research, what can we do to increase the likelihood of people feeling safe to come forward about these experiences that are happening in their regions? Is there anything from your perspectives on that so we can get a better sense of how to address the problem from a data set? Anybody?
I mean, I think for us, it's building these relationships of trust with folks on the ground is always really imperative. Working with other organizations, transitional justice mechanisms, places where people who have experienced sexual violence know that there's a place where they can seek accountability, where they can report and feel safe and feel heard. I think that's truly one of the best approaches, and it truly does take a whole community effort, at the local and at the national and at the international scale to make sure that those mechanisms and those access to justice platforms exist.
Yep. I think that's very well said.
And I would just say some of it goes back to the capacity building efforts you were talking about earlier, making sure that the judicial system, that police forces and others are in a position to take testimony and to protect witnesses and to gather information in a way that is not threatening. We do a lot of that kind of work around the world, but always there are huge gaps in capacity and much to be done.
And I think in addition to looking at some of the state capacities there, I mean, certainly we've talked about and we've heard about some of the local organisations and the work that they're doing, and ensuring that those organisations have the resources, have the support to be able to deliver some of those services and make sure there is an environment that is guided by the survivors themselves in terms of what their needs are, I think is absolutely essential.
Yeah, I think that's great. And also one thing I want to go back to what Annie said about communication is, because Christy mentioned this, is sometimes it's not so much like, oh, we don't want to talk about that, but it's that, oh no, we're good with, like, there's no problem here. Because that's not something, but maybe if it's communicated in a way where they also understand it from a regional, a cultural, linguistic, or in a way that's more understood, then they can work closer to recognizing a problem does exist for the conversation to be had at the same time. I did get a note from Annie, and so unfortunately she can't share this, but I want to say that some of the work that they do is they do mobile aid clinics and also mobile health clinics, and they have social aid houses to host survivors. I think that's incredibly important as well, and I'll just go back to something I said earlier, is it's not just addressing the problem and like the instance, the scenario, it's also about making sure that the person can rebuild, because as we learned from things that exacerbate conflict from Colleen, and also what everyone else has mentioned about indirect consequences, that if you don't, it's not just addressing the issue, it's also working to fix future consequences from occurring, and that means that we have to support survivors. So the work that Annie's doing in her organization, it's just absolutely incredible. And to that end, I just want to have a closing question for everyone, is maybe what can all these different stakeholders in this room right now, what can we do so from the American Red Cross perspective about doing these dissemination type events? Is it more about like spreading the word and spreading the message? Is what can people do to help support addressing this conflict, maybe if they're not at a state level or an international governmental level? Anybody want to add on to that? What can someone do in the United States at a local level to help do this? Just spread awareness?
It's always a good start.
Yeah. That's a great first step. I mean, I see a lot of students in the room too. The fact that you're taking classes on these issues or doing internships or learning about these issues is also a great way. If you're interested in pursuing this as a career option, certainly the more people that are interested in working in this area, the better.
Annie, I saw you move towards the computer, so I wanted to see if you had something to say. You can shake your head no. Okay, yes. We're going to try one more time because I appreciate everything you have to say.
I believe that we need more support on women's integration in peace processes. And also women's inclusion in technology. Use of new technology, collect data, to analyze data, to document, and also to report them. Sometimes we do have a lot of information.
Annie, we heard pretty much most of what you said, but then we had the mic issue at the end, but we heard the major point of it, and I think that inclusion part is incredibly important. So with that, we have a few minutes left, and
Lisa wants to jump.
Oh,
sorry.
Lisa,
Yeah,
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. I wasn't.
Failed as a moderator.
No,
Go.
but I'm gonna seize. I hope I don't mind in terms of what Annie's point there in terms of women's participation in these processes, peace processes, making sure women are at the table, that these issues are actually part of the conversation when you were talking about ending conflict and peace agreements, because so often they just get sidelined. And so anything that we, I think, can do to amplify exactly the points that Annie has made there is absolutely critical, because it's not sadly just about addressing these instances when they happen, but how do we prevent them? And a big part of that is actually making sure that we're integrating this into the conversations that our political leaders are having and making sure that women have a meaningful and inclusive seat at that table. And I think that's absolutely essential.
Yeah, and failure to
And
do
long
so.
before peace processes even begin too,
Yeah.
like not just at the peace process at the end, but all the way through.
Yeah. Notwithstanding the fact that this does not just impact women, but I think that's part of that bigger conversation that could have a really transformative impact on some aspect of this challenge.
And I would just say that in terms of our foreign policy and as we look at the world, it's not, we recognize absolutely that women need to have a place at the table and be involved in decision making and peace building processes. But I think increasingly we're seeing too that it's important to involve not just women but other marginalized and underrepresented groups, different ethnic communities that might in a particular context be excluded, LGBTQI plus individuals and religious groups, and so increasingly in our efforts overseas, we're trying to be as inclusive as possible and to bring into these peace building and decision making processes as many people as possible. Because if you're going to work through conflict and prevent conflict from occurring, you do have to work through so many grievances, often grievances that are long-standing and deeply entrenched in society.
And the more people at the table, the better, because like we talked about taking ownership, it makes people feel like they have a piece of this, and that is going to more likely lead to a successful post-transition out of conflict at the same time. All right. Is there any questions from the audience? I want to open it up at that time with the last remaining minutes that we have. We'll start here. You can stand, so they know who it is. Oh, wait.
We've got a couple.
All right, we're going here.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Megan Rogers, and I am the U.S. Policy Advocacy Manager at Nonviolent Peace Force. And I would just like to hear your thoughts, Lisa especially, but anyone else who wants to add to this, about the dependency of the current protection structures on armed actors. And you mentioned briefly that peacekeeping missions don't last forever. They come and they go, and it made me think of NP's work in Sudan started shortly after the withdrawal of forces from that area. And we do unarmed civilian protection work of training civilians to do protective accompaniment or other protective measures without those dependency on armed groups. And so I found it to be very effective and including local actors and much more sustainable than external forces. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that, your experience with that, and any other movements that any of your organizations would do to protect that civilian self-protection method.
Yeah, well, we're going to take one more, and that way we can address both of them.
Thank you. I was wondering, we talked a lot about sort of a victim-based approach, which is obviously so important, and especially in the transitional justice arena. But I was wondering, too, in terms of the IHL and international criminal law and gender-based violence, sexual violence being used as a weapon of war, considering the difficulty that governments during peacetime and countries with really good rule of law adherence have in addressing gender-based and sexual violence domestically in peacetime, sort of what can we do to ensure that the war and the weaponization element is dealt with during our conflict? Thank you.
So Lisa, maybe you want to address the first question.
Thank you, Megan. It was an excellent question in terms of, you're spot on. I mean, the physical militarized protection is not going to be the long-lasting solution that addresses a lot of these issues. And we know, whether it's the peacekeeping mission or some components, or the work that NP does in a number of these contexts through accompaniment and other measures, observing, through presence, through human rights monitoring, through early warning mechanisms, there is a lot that can be done that is not, really that's the last resort in terms of intervention if you're getting to that point where you need to have some kind of military or force intervention to prevent it. And ideally, you don't want to get to that point, and you want to find ways around that, whether it's the longer term prevention measures or it's through using the civilian presence or unarmed actors who may be in a position to support some of those measures. So I think it's a really key question. How can they support and work? And I know NP has a lot of really good evidence in terms of the work and practices that have been done in a number of different country contexts, but I think it's really, really important that we look at a range of measures and don't just default to some that may be seen as, well, we happen to have a tool here and it may not fit and we're going to use it, but actually look across the spectrum of what's available, and it is going to be best at the end of the day to prevent this.
I think to the question on, I think you get to a lot of the structural issues that underlie some of these challenges. There was a wonderful article in The Economist, I think about a year and a half or 2 years ago, that said that societies that treat their women badly are less stable and poorer and less stable. And it talked about a lot of the different cross-cutting issues, whether it be gender discrimination, equal pay, access to food, violence against women, access to education. I mean, you name the structure, and if you discriminate against women in those structures, it creates less stable, poorer, and more violent communities. And as communities become more violent, then when an element of conflict comes in, or a grievance arises, and there's conflict within a community, the acts of violence, which are normalized, become more exacerbated, especially when you have a highly militarized or masculine cultural component embedded into these. It drives up the levels of violence, and it also it normalizes the ways in which, especially during an armed conflict, violence is perpetrated towards women and other people who don't belong, whether they be a minority community, ethnic or religious, or a sexual minority. And so you see how all of these issues are compounded and integrated. And so I think for us to change these issues, we really have to start looking at some of the structural underlying issues of how do we treat women? How do we treat minorities? How do we treat those who are less empowered in any community? And until we start addressing these root causes, the violence is going to continue. It's going to be more common. It's not always a guarantee that it will happen, but it is more likely. And so I think we really do need to be talking about some of these underlying structural issues, at the same time making sure that there's accountability, that there's rule of law, that there's implementation of rules that do address these issues, and that people who have been harmed by them can seek redress for the harms that they've received.
Certainly the U.S. government has recognized over the last couple of years the need to address these principles of equity and inclusion, not just domestically but overseas. So increasingly that's becoming part of the conversations that we have, and part of the ways in which we try to act to resolve or to address some of these problems, and ideally to prevent conflict. I mean, because you're absolutely right, there are so many cross-cutting issues. They're all interconnected, and we have to address those structural issues, I think, in most cases more than anything else. And certainly if we can do that at the beginning, it's less costly in so many ways over the long term.
Absolutely.
And also, how do we treat victims? Because sometimes, societies don't even realize at times, individuals don't even realize at times that, there might be a shame that they place on the individual, and that just, that's collateral damage from to use a term of IHL right there. So any other questions? No? Well, with that, I want to thank our panelists and everyone for joining us. Thank you to the Stimson Center for hosting, and everyone back there who made it possible. And Annie, thank you so much for joining us and spending your evening/night with us. So thank you so much.